Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
Point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? So welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Together with me is Stephen and Cameron. And this time I thought we could try to discuss different scientific discoveries and what kind of influence this has had on our ability or the religious position in the world. And I think that the Copernicus revolution might be like a starting point, and what kind of influence this had on different religious positions, especially in Christianity, of course, because that's where this discovery started. So, Stephen, what do you think?
That's a great place to start. Maybe we start a little bit earlier and then hit Copernicus, because one thing that that no doubt had a major impact at the time of its discovery. We could go back a couple thousand years earlier to one of the first recorded Greek philosophers. Who was it who made the prediction of the eclipses? Was that Thales, who was famous for predicting eclipses, which prior to that, people probably assumed that the world was controlled by spiritual forces, by the whims of the gods that were essentially unpredictable, that there was a kind of divine fiat at work in the world that made us human beings completely at the mercy of these, spiritual or divine forces beyond our control. And then you have this fellow coming along who noticed, there's patterns in these natural events that people took to be actions of the gods. We can predict eclipses. And then we have things like the Antikythera mechanism, where the ancient Greeks, took that predictability of eclipses and turned it into mechanisms that you could use to make these predictions, and we don't know what use these sorts of mechanisms were put to, but no doubt they had a profound influence on how people thought about the world. This may have been our first historical sort of record of this dawning understanding that there is a regularity, like a mathematical regularity behind the way things work, which was an opening to thinking about the world as not controlled by arbitrary forces, but controlled by things that our minds can comprehend and then manipulate and then leverage and make use of.
But because I think that some of these predictions or some of these could also be understood as the human being closer to the gods than the people who didn't have those predictions. I think in old ancient Egypt, the priest was those who also had the ability to foresee when the Nile was gonna flow or not. So and also Pythagoras and the mathematicians in Greece had also some kind of religious connection. So I think it might be changing some of the religious understanding, but maybe it just changed and it kept another way of or the ability to be religious.
That's a great point. Did it bring us up to the level of the gods, or did it bring the gods down to our level?
Yeah.
And what's the difference between the two? There was a kind of a closing of a gap, but which side moved, I guess, would be the question.
And there is, I mean, this also reminds me of this, what is known as God of gaps, and the idea that in the more modern apologetical position that religion has taken in relation to science, the idea has been to show that there must be a divine existence because science cannot explain everything, and it's been those gaps that have sort of been filled by God. And of course, this has been very bad for God because he is sort of squeezed out of these places more and more as science develops. And that's why I know, Stephen, that you have a different approach as a scientist to this, which has always been very inspiring for me, that instead of seeing God as explaining things that science cannot, we go the other way around and say, like, that science is something that helps us better understand how God works. And I think that I may be wrong, but I think that it was maybe for the first time, most clearly, this was brought up in Islamic culture, where even something like, I come originally from Iran, so Persian carpets are very they're world famous, and even in the patterns that Persian carpets have, one tries to geometrically and artistically show the order that exists in the universe and the infinity that exists. So I think there was this idea that if we understand nature, if we understand science, it gives us good leads to better appreciating divine creation.
Could you also, Cameron, just to when you mentioned the carpet, could you explain the picture we have got for the profile of our podcast?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because the picture. Thank you very much that you brought it up. That was very, very good. Yeah, the picture, I mean, is actually from Islamic ornament. I think it's actually from probably interior ornamentation of a mosque, which exactly shows just like the carp. I mean, different forms of Islamic art were very geometrical and tried through geometry to portray divine order. And
this is only half of the picture.
Half of the picture, that's right. And the other half is a fractal, which is actually showing how in nature you have order even in what seems to be chaos. And we wanted to bring these side by side to show really this closeness of a religious and scientific approach and how they can complement each other.
But still, there has been a lot of problem and even bloody fights between science and religious, and I think the Galileo Galilei and the Copernicus revolution afterwards was one of those bloody fights. Stephen?
Yeah, that was one huge closing of a gap, I suppose, was Copernicus's theory that gave a kind of order and structure to the universe, that again took things out of the realm of arbitrary action of the gods into the realm of something that has a kind of mathematical clockwork regularity to it. And And that has started, and that triggered this cascade over the last few centuries of the gap progressively becoming smaller and smaller as we understand more and more of the physical universe around us, and are able to explain more and more of the phenomena that we experience. Although certain gaps notably remain, the gap of why the universe bothers to exist in the first place, the gap of how life emerges in all its complexity. So there are gaps for those who are still gap-minded about thinking about matter and spirit. But I think the record, over the last few centuries is against that school of thought, because the gaps do seem to be shrinking. But fortunately, we have, there are ways of looking at the world that affirm that kind of mystical spiritual quality of things without putting it in the gap. And these aren't new ideas, but these ideas are as old as the gap thinking themselves. I'm thinking of this carpet, Cami, that you bring up, the Persian carpets having the symbols of the universe in them. The Sufi idea, which is also very much part of Persian culture. There's a famous statement by Rumi that says, "Dost thou consider thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded?" And Rumi was echoing a much earlier and older idea that's ascribed to a mystical, prophetic, philosophical figure by the name of Hermes, whose writings are, as far as we know, probably lost, but statements ascribed to Hermes exist in the Arabic literature. One of which is a short little statement that is taken to be the secret of alchemy, and it begins with the statement that which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, to accomplish the miracles of one thing. And so Rumi is kind of echoing this idea many centuries later. And this very much flies in the face of the God of the gaps thinking, because it says something about this correspondence between ourselves and the universe. So one would expect then to find, the more one delves into the workings of the universe, and conversely, the more one delves inwardly through spiritual practice, through meditative practice, through philosophical investigation, the more one understands the one, the more tools and leverage one has to understand the other.
And I think also that this idea that part of the universe, I think that was one of the central problem with that happened when Copernicus discovered that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And then this idea that above us was heaven, and in heaven God was, and below us was hell, and that's where the devil. And I think that there shouldn't be much problem actually to remove this thought of this the church thought of the earth as a center, and make the earth and God becoming part of the universe, and not something only belonging to the earth.
One could look at the progress of our scientific understanding of the world over the last half a millennium or so as a progressive decentering of humanity, which we could think of began with a naive conception of us being the center of the universe, the center of everything. And then the Copernican revolution decenters us physically. So we're now thrust out of the center of things, and something else is put in the center. And that decentering, continues as we discover that, okay, now the sun isn't the center of things, but maybe the center of our galaxy is the center of the known universe, before we discovered that there were other galaxies. And then suddenly our galaxy is just a mote of dust in a swirling chaos of hundreds of millions of galaxies, and those are just the ones that we can count. So we get physically decentered all the way until we're just a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, in Carl Sagan's famous phrase. But that decentering is even more profound than that, because when Charles Darwin finds that that the pathways of the emergence of species also follows a kind of predictive not regularity, because it's very chaotic, but follows a perfectly natural explanation that doesn't require outside teleological forces, humanity gets decentered, I think, even more profoundly, because we're now no longer the center of the universe in terms of purpose. We now become something which is accidental, something which is which we think of as because we're very human centered. We naturally think of ourselves as the almost inevitable outcome of things, but the Darwinian decentering of humanity turned us into an accident, and we're still coping with that a century and a half later, and we're still trying to come to terms with whether we are simply accidental and simply a mote of dust in a sunbeam, or whether there is a way to think of us, our consciousness, maybe not our species, but our consciousness, which may be found elsewhere in the universe, as somehow still important in some way. And I think that's one of the fundamental questions behind this whole podcast, behind this whole tension between Athens and Jerusalem. The more we understand the Athens piece, the more we understand the physical universe, the less important we seem. But the Jerusalem piece tells us we are important. We are not just important, but we are crucial. We're the keystone of the arch. We're the purpose of the existence of everything. And is there a way, having shed these naive conceptions of the world that put us in the center in a very physical sense, in a very naive sense, is there a way, following the arc of our expanding understanding of the universe, to return to understanding consciousness in a central way, while losing the naive conception of it that characterized our thinking in earlier times?
I think this is such an important and key question that I suggest that we actually dedicate a specific session to this very question. And I would like to maybe go back to this idea of the more general sort of influence of modern science on metaphysical thinking. And I think that, to me anyway, as a layman in this field, it's been very fascinating that whereas sort of the earlier 18th and 19th century science seemed to somehow demystify the universe and say, well, everything is observable, and we can see the Lego bits that put this thing together, and whatever you cannot observe with your senses can be discluded from any intelligent discussion. And then it seems that with the Einsteinian sort of view to universe and everything that came with that, all of a sudden the universe sort of regained its mysticism. And it's very interesting that many of the not necessarily religious but mystical thinkers of our more recent times are actually physicists. And I think the problem is that most laymen, and especially social scientists who don't really understand science in great depth, they still live in the worldview of early 19th century, late 19th century and early 20th century sort of view of science. And only that everything is concrete, and whatever is not concrete is not real. And that kind of a very, very naive view of scientific view of reality, whereas actually science has long ago passed that. And So in that sense, I think it's very interesting that as science has developed, it has, I think, helped us to see this connection between Athens and Jerusalem, because I mean, you would be able to explain this better, Steve, as a physicist, but
Yeah.
I find that sort of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. But
No, because we have discussed physics and natural science before, but this time I thought maybe we should also focus more on psychology and behaviorism. And I think also because this Darwin you mentioned, and decentralization of human being in whatever we are, and then I think Freud had maybe was one of those really removed even the center of human. I think it became difficult to talk about a soul and a spirit in human after Freud, and especially with behavioristic psychology and even some kind of cognitive science. Like, yeah, I've been reading Merleau-Ponty for the moment, and he's focusing. He's like the grandfather of embedded cognition, and in this way of thinking, that you might. There are thoughts that I think doesn't give any possibility of a human spirit or soul. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest scientific movements that makes a religious position difficult.
That was a very good point. Especially since I think that what has also happened is that psychology has somehow replaced, I mean, or there has been this tendency for psychology to replace what formerly was understood as spirituality. So psychology is seen as the only sort of other dimension of human beings than our physical being, whereas to me psychology is quite obviously part of our physical being, because it's something that emanates from our brains, which is of course part of our sort of physical apparatus. But it's very interesting. I think this was a very good point that you raised.
I can try to explain it a little bit further, because there was a discussion between Romain Rolland, that he was one of the Nobel Peace Prize, no, not Peace Prize, but Literature Prize winners, and Sigmund Freud. And Roland claimed that the reason that human had a religious dimension was our feeling, this feeling he called the ocean feeling, the feeling that we are being part of something bigger, that we are connected to the universe and to reality. And Freud, his explanation was our subconscious and our way of growing up. And he explained this ocean feeling, that there was only the human being still wanted to be hanging on to the breast of their mothers. And I think that's exactly these different thoughts, and how Freud removes every he makes everything very how should we say it becomes very natural, or very only part of what the environment brings into us. So we are more or less just response to our environment. Yeah.
It's a reductionist tendency which is seen in all of the disciplines, which is a natural, I would say, a natural response to the runaway success of science, beginning with Copernicus, going forward. That if it's so successful using this mathematical modeling of the heavens, why don't we use it for everything else as well, all the way down to something as enormously complex as the human psyche. We'd like to, and we still want to do that. There's still a sort of inertia of this clockwork universe, the Newtonian clockwork universe that that people still think of when they think of science, is that it's able to reduce everything to its physical components and explain away all phenomena in terms of those physical components. But even moving away from the physics side of this, something I've been looking at over the past few weeks are these fascinating videos on YouTube and you can check for these yourselves. The DNA animations by Drew Barry, animations of DNA and ribosomes and so forth, and the amazing complexity behind how the DNA is converted into proteins in the cell. I think this relates in the following way. DNA is as we know, the basis for the human genome. It defines and what we are physically and constructs us on a cellular level. But we can't describe what DNA is purely in terms of what it does chemically. In other words, we can't just say that that the explanation of how things work, even on a cellular level, can purely be reduced to the mechanism of DNA having a particular chemical effect in the cell. We have to include the fact that DNA includes information. It codes for amino acids, which then are chained together to produce proteins, and it's the chemical effect of the proteins that work inside the cell that give the sort of all the physical sort of the physical properties that life has. But DNA has this dual property that it acts both chemically. It has a physical presence. It has energy associated with it. It has a solubility. It has all these sorts of physical properties. But in the sequence of base pairs in the DNA, it contains something else. It contains something abstract, something symbolic. The 3 base pairs code for an amino acid, and a bunch of amino acids code for a protein. This is language. This is sort of the origin of language, which is a symbolic thing. It's words strung together to form sentences and paragraphs and a whole story. So even at that level, I mean, not just talking, we could go in the direction of physics and quantum mechanics and so forth to get to consciousness and try to recenter consciousness, having been decentered through this, centuries-long process. But I think just the discovery of the chemical properties of DNA, looking biologically, there's a kind of inevitability that one cannot describe the world solely in terms of the physics and the chemistry. Information comes in. What is that information? How does information sort of emerge in the evolution of things? There seems to be a kind of mystery there that we haven't yet fully understood. And somewhere there, I'm convinced lies a key to recovering the importance and centrality of consciousness. I know that's a big leap, but yeah.
I think that the same I would say about cognitive science. They really try to understand everything of what's going on in the brain, and nowadays they say that when we get stimuli from outside, there is some kind of global ignition going on throughout the whole brain, emotional, logical, motorical, all these centers, ethical centers. They are, or maybe we couldn't even call it a center, but it's global. But still, there are no sign of who is editing it, who is the editor of what of those signals that we are actually. Yeah, how is it possible for babies to edit the signals of noise that goes into the brain and make them able to understand the patterns in the noise that makes it into words that they are able to understand and to read and to
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I agree that I think this issue of consciousness becomes a key issue, and perhaps here, of course, the classical question of mind and brain. But I would like to also, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Sam Harris, and he's an interesting figure because he's a sworn atheist, but more recently he has studied, even through personal experience, this kind of meditative approach of consciousness and sort of mystical, I would say, levels of consciousness, which are not irrational, but I would say they're supra-rational. And he has come to the conclusion, although he says it has nothing to do with religion or God, but that human beings have this ability of being conscious of and experienced meaningfully something which is cannot be just reduced to rational and logical reasoning, the way that we see the brain working as that kind of a machine. So I think that's also fascinating.
We have discussed different dimension in human beings before in this podcast, and I think interpretation of Plato, we often say that the leader in human action should be rationality or logical thinking. But what you try to say, Cameron, if I understand you correctly, is that there might be a different dimension, a more super rational dimension that maybe is more like the editor or the what is really the human soul.
Exactly. The human soul or the human mind, which to me are almost synonymous, because I mean, I think that one way, I mean, one analogy that one could use is to think of the brain as the computer and the mind or the soul as the programmer. Now, obviously, a programmer needs a computer in order to be able to show his skills and to actually implement the knowledge that he has. But even if the computer should break down, the programmer is not affected by it, and the computer is only reflecting the skills and the knowledge of the programmer. And I think in this way we could maybe think that the brain is a vehicle that manifests the powers of human soul and mind, but essentially our thinking, our awareness, our consciousness, and even, for instance, something that we call love, are more than just electrical or chemical reactions in part of our body that we call the brain.
This division of our brains into hardware and software, it seems like a really good analogy, because I mean, again, going to like DNA, it seems like DNA is both hardware and software, and that's so we see that at various levels in the world. But it also begs the question, you know, if our brains are hardware and software, then it leads to the question of, well, there's a programmer out there somewhere, and then doesn't that sort of bring Cartesian dualism back in through the back door? Doesn't it then beg the question, okay, well then we've taken our understanding of the universe and we shoved all of our ignorance in a sort of God of the gaps fashion to this entity, which is the programmer of the software of our brains. And now we have to answer that question. You know, all the questions that we thought we were answering about the universe have now been sort of pushed one level back, and we really have to start asking, well, then where does the programmer come from? What is, and how does it come to be in charge of the software, and so forth?
Maybe dualism ain't that bad. I mean, I know that we because we might discuss what is actually the dualism. What is those different dimension in human, and I think also, I think in when I meet people today, I think there's too many of them believe that when there are some problems, it's always outside of ourselves, and it's always something in the environment or whatever. And in me, I often think that I got more of the problems inside, and that there are some kind of dialectical discussions or polarized experience. And I think those dualities are really existing in us, in our way of being.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that duality can mean two things. It can mean that there are simply that there are different levels or dimensions of phenomena, which I think as such is not polarizing, because I think this whole theme of Athens and Jerusalem actually refers to a duality which we are trying to find ways of bringing together, so that there would be like two different approaches that are complementary, but we cannot say that there aren't different approaches. And I think the same way, like the mind and the brain could be seen as dualistic, but not necessarily dichotomous in the sense that they are somehow against each other or excluding each other, but rather completing each other. I don't know how you would you would buy that, Steve.
Yeah, maybe we can think of dualism as a very useful heuristic. It's a very useful way of navigating the world, and the world really is divided at some level. It really is mind and matter. There really is hardware and software. I mean, DNA really is both a chemical and an information carrying object. So dualism is not just a figment of our imagination. At the same time, when we seek to sort of the ultimate explanations of things, which maybe the kind of investigation that not everyone has to do. I mean, it's something that privileged people who have the time and the to ask these sorts of questions want to know, well, what is the ultimate explanation? That's where the current explanation that the scientific project offers us is that everything ultimately reduces to this one thing, which is matter and mechanism and kind of the deterministic laws of physics. And another direction we could go is to see mind and matter and the dualism which is manifest in the world as reducible to something else, not reducible to mechanism and inert matter, but reducible to something which is more of a mutuality of consciousness and matter emerging simultaneously. And this is where one can't not at least reference the 20th century developments in quantum mechanics, which I think suggest precisely this, that there's a mutuality of what we could call matter and information, or spirit and body, or pick your dualistic phrases, but that both somehow kind of emerge together. Because in the end, isn't it more satisfying to posit a single origin for things than two separate origins for things?
Absolutely. And I think, and I was very good that you take up this point of origin, because I think it's not so much obviously, well, not obviously, but anyway, I think that we could well think that the universe is actually a sort of a unified phenomenon, where there is essential unity and it's definitely an origin of things. But I think this duality is more on the level of the, so to say, the manifestation of that original power or impulse or whatever, and maybe it's a little bit like, you know, the phenomenon of light, that we have, you know, we have light that can be seen as a spectrum of different colors, but that then in the end, when they come together, there is only really just light, and as you said, the spectrum is a heuristic device more than anything else.
We could also invoke the wisdom of the Far East in the opening verses of the Tao Te Ching. You know, that there's a kind of a oneness that precedes everything, and from the one emerges the two, and then from the two emerges all things. And so you have both the idea of primal unity, but also the idea of a almost primal duality of things, of course represented in the yin yang symbol that everyone is familiar with. And then the interaction of the polarity of that duality then gives rise to all things. Somehow we want to have our cake and eat it too. You know, we want to be able to sort of admit that mind is a thing, consciousness is a thing, not reducible to matter, but at the same time, we do want there to be a sort of a unified origin to things, because I suppose because maybe that's a philosophical bias, that we want there to be a single origin to things instead of a double origin to things, and perhaps we should just go out and say it. This is a philosophical bias that some of us have, that we want to have a simple explanation rather than a complex explanation. Given that the universe is complex, why should that that philosophical bias necessarily be true? Having said that, I'm still firmly in the camp that there ought to be a single origin to things, but we should at least put on the table that there are other ways of thinking about it.
Right. So maybe next time we can pursue this theme, especially through the phenomenon of human consciousness that was referred to, because I think that might be a place where we can get further ideas and notions of this.
And I think we just need to know more. What do we understand by human consciousness?
Exactly.
So we could stop there. Just a question, because just for the listener, for us also, is it legal? Is it normal to talk about the soul? Do people nowadays say that they have a soul, or is it something that belongs to history?
I think many people use the word soul. I mean, I don't think they always even use it in the most physical sense. But yeah, I think when people want to refer to something which is a bit more refined than just cognitive or calculated behavior, they talk about the soul.
It's nice to hear, Cameron. Even in Sweden.
Even in Sweden more and more. Yeah. I think soul is much easier for people to accept than God and religion. So yeah. So that's why we might go for human. I think that's why it's actually very fruitful if we focus on things like human consciousness, or even terms like soul and mind, to find our way forward to those.
Yeah, agree. So then we end this session, and then we see you again later.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juli's technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.